If we've talked about inheritance, it's time to discuss about abstract contracts and interfaces. So an abstract contract has at least one function that lacks implementation. An abstract contract cannot be deployed. And if we set the contract constructor as internal, we made that contract abstract. Let's try an example. We'll continue the example from our last lecture by transforming this base contract in an abstract contract. If I delete the implementation of this function, of setX function, my contract becomes an abstract contract. If I try to deploy the base contract, I'll get an error. This contract does not implement all functions and thus cannot be created. If I want to deploy the A contract, the contract that inherits the base contract, I'll get the same error. It's mandatory that all functions to be implemented. So inside A, it's mandatory to implement the setX function. And now x equals underline x. We have all functions implemented, so if we want, we can deploy the A contract. Let's see something else. I'll modify the setX function from the base contract as it was. So x equals underline x. And here I write underline x equals 10. If I deploy the A contract, which function will be called? The setX function from the base contract or setX function from the A contract? So let's say setX 77 and now x is 10 because as you imagined, the function from the derived contract will be called. Another possibility to make this contract abstract is to declare the constructor as internal. A contract with an internal constructor is an abstract contract. So now we have an abstract contract. If I try to deploy the base contract, I'll get an error because there is an internal constructor. Let's talk about interfaces. Interfaces are similar to abstract contracts, but they cannot have any functions implemented. Interfaces can be inherited, and there are further restrictions. For example, they cannot inherit other contracts or interfaces. They cannot define a constructor. An abstract contract can define a constructor. The interfaces cannot define variables. Abstract contracts can define variables. Interfaces cannot define structs and enums variables, but our abstract contracts can define those types of variables. An interface is created using the interface keyword instead of contract. Now that we have seen what is an interface, let's create an interface in a real example. So here I'll create an interface using the interface keyword named token interface. And inside the interface, I declare one function. Let's say transfer token. This function has three arguments: an address underline from, address underline to, and int underline value. This is an external function and returns a bool. Okay, this is an interface. Of course, we cannot deploy an interface. If we want to deploy the token interface, we'll get an error. And now let's create another contract named myToken that inherits the token interface. So is token interface. It's mandatory for this contract to implement this function. Otherwise, this contract cannot be deployed. If I try to deploy my token, I'll get an error. I must implement this function. So let's implement the function. I'll declare a mapping variable with keys of type address and values of type int named balances. And now I'll define the transfer token function. So transfer token address from address to int value. External or public, let's say external, this function will be called from an external application, returns bool. And the function definition is balance of from minus equal underline value. So we subtract the value from the balance of this address and we'll add the same value to the balance of underline 2 address. So balance underline 2 plus equal underline value. And this function returns true. Okay, here we have balances and not balance. This is my function implementation. Now I can deploy my token contract. The contract can be deployed. It is also very important that the implemented function has the same number of arguments and those arguments must have the same type. So if here I write uint, so the interface function has an uint argument and this argument is an integer argument, this is not good. I cannot deploy my token contract because it considers this function another function, not the implementation of the interface function. We cannot deploy the contract. So here I have an int type. Let's test my token contract. Let's erase all deployments from here and here, and using the first account I'll deploy my token contract. Deployed, and using the second address from here I write it between double quotes. This is the first argument, the second argument is the third address, and the value is 100. So in fact this address transfers this value to this address. Of course we don't verify that those addresses have that value in their balances, but it's just a simple example. And the tokens have been transferred. Now if I want to see what is the balance of this address, I can see here that it has 100 and the other address has minus 100. This is how interfaces, which are a mandatory API that must be implemented, are used. In our ERC token contract, we'll use an abstract contract or an interface. See you in the next lecture where we'll start developing our fully compliant ERC token.